I'm going to present a paper with Andrew Shepard at UPenn about school investment, mismatch, and wage inequality. So the basic idea is really simple if you think about it. We all know by now that wage inequality has increased a lot in a lot of countries over the last 40 years. And there have been many proposals to just try to address this level of wage inequality. But the most prominent policies are really designed in the education space. And there are usually things that are going to be either free college or things that want to make college debt free. So usually the idea is to reduce the cost of education so that most people or more people can access higher education. The problem is that if you want to frame that question that way, we want to increase education so that to reduce wage inequality, we as economists don't know a lot about what is the interplay between the supply of education and wage inequality. Why? It's because of the way we do things. Like usually when you think about everything that has been, or most of the things at least, that has been done on this space, there are two types of model. The first types are just quasi-experimental variation. A state has been offering tuition reduction to some people, and there is this quasi-experimental study that shows that if you have usually $1,000 reduction in the cost of education, supply is going to increase by something between 2 or 4%. We know that usually this is a partial equilibrium effect, but that's something like consensus in the literature. The second type of approach is going to be in equilibrium, but usually it's competitive equilibrium. And the way that works is that you have an increase in supply, and because it's competitive equilibrium, demand is going to go, prices are going to go down, so wages are going to go down. So that if you think about the general equilibrium, at least the welfare effect, it's not clear that you are doing anything because as wages are going down, the relative gain from having higher education is going to go down as well. Okay? Here, what we are going to say is slightly different. We are going to think about the supply of education as having what we call a non-neutral effect on labor demand. Basic idea being that if you create more skilled jobs in the economy, firms may change their production technology to accommodate this more skilled labor, and that may change the nature of the demand. And then if you start thinking about the equilibrium effect, it gets much more complicated because you need to think about how mismatch is going to change. So given the set of jobs in the economy, you are going to have some people that are going to be more mismatched in the equilibrium than what you see in the benchmarks. Okay? And that's what we are going to do. So essentially, if you think about our mechanism, that's really the best way to see it. So this is the supply of education, and I'm just measuring supply by the supply of college graduates in the US. In green here, you have the supply of college graduate, and in blue, the supply, and in green, you have a demand for college graduate, demand being defined by the share of college required jobs in the economy. Okay? And you see that there is a really strong correlation between these two numbers, and over the last 20 years, you see this strong correlation. So how we are going to do that? So we are going to have an equilibrium search model. You have a question?
Yeah, what is that, John?
That I'm gonna show you. I will show you in a couple of slides, okay? I didn't make it up. It's and it annoys me more than anything. So you have what I'm going to do is introduce human capital investment in an equilibrium search model, okay? And try in the same time to have a labor demand model that's realistic and that can answer to a supply change. And the basic idea would be that policies and education policies are not going to have an effect not only on the supply of education, but also on the demand of education. And that will allow us to think about not only as general equilibrium, but to think about long-run general equilibrium changes, long run being demand is going to adjust, and we see how the welfare of people is going to change. The key feature of the model is that because we are going to work with a search model, there is going to be some efficiency concern. for a couple of reasons. The first is because of a hold-up problem. Investments are going to be made before you enter the labor market. And at that point, you cannot revisit your education if you don't match with a right set of firms. And the second type of inefficiency is going to come from the fact that we are going to assume that wages are going to be bargained. So you get a share of something. And the problem with that is that usually people are not going to internalize the effect of their decisions on other workers. And that's going to create efficiency problems such that you are going to need some policy to address the fact that choices are not efficient. Okay? And because we are going to work with a search model, we are going to have a lot of mismatch in the model. And I'm calling that mismatch on the intensive and extensive margin. It's possible that you don't find a job, but it's possible that you find a job that doesn't match your education. So you end up overeducated or undereducated. And we are going to allow for all of those things. Okay? I'm going to skip that for the interest of time. I hope no one here is offended. It's really just because of time. In terms of findings, we are going to find that if you decrease the cost of education by $1,000, in our long-run equilibrium effect, you increase the welfare increase by something like 1%, 0.88 to be completely correct. But you still have an effect, even in the short-run equilibrium, which is going to be much, much smaller, which is half of the effect. And labor demand margins are going to be important because firms are going to adjust their demand for labor. They are going to post more skill-intensive positions, and that's why you end up with more welfare gains. But the interesting result that we also find is that you also increase wage inequality. And you increase wage inequality because you have created more high productivity jobs. So higher ability workers are going to find better jobs much more easily. And through search, we are going to be able to extract a larger part of the rent. And there is almost going to be no labor market friction for those people. While at the bottom of the distribution, if you are low ability and now in the counterfactual you are more educated, it's going to be much, much harder for you to end up in those type of jobs. Okay? And that's what we are going to find in the paper. Okay, just to go back to the data and why there is a jump. So we are now using a lot of data just to characterize everything that's in the paper. So we have CPS and ACS education attainment, and we are going to use that to do some nice regression that's going to motivate the paper a little bit more. The data, or at least the figure I showed you, was coming from the BLS occupational employment wage statistics. So it's estimate by state that the BLS is conducting, essentially estimating how many jobs for each occupation there is. And because it's estimates, sometimes they change the way they estimate things. That's why you see the jump in the data. And it's really a jump in the data. It's not a change in definition of anything. It's just a change in how the BLS has been estimating those numbers. We are going to use data from NLSY to do most of the heavy lifting when we get to the model. We are going to use data from ONET to get a definition of skill requirement. And finally, the way I'm going to define skill requirement, now we are doing it two ways. We can take ONET, so it's a collection of jobs. We see what firms are saying is the education required to land in that occupation, and we can take the mode of that. That's one way to do it. The other way is that the BLS, because they have been working on these type of questions for a long time, they have constructed something like a crosswalk between occupations and skill requirement for each of those occupations. And when we compare those two things, they are really close. There is something like 5% of occupation where they do not match. And most of the time, it's usually jobs that are defined as being really low educated, so less than high school jobs. Okay, so we are going to run the model with both definition and show you that it really doesn't matter when we get there. So, and that's the first figure I was showing you, but with all the education group. The most important thing that I want you to see here, LHS is less than high school graduate here, some college and college, okay? And this is supply and demand, and you see for all of those four cases, we are moving in the same direction. But if you look at some college, which is a margin that we are working with now, like demand for some college is really small, or it's almost 10%. It's really constant over time. And one of the reasons why that's the case is that it seems like no one created a job saying, I want some college person here. It's some college seems to be a mismatched state by definition. And because of that, it doesn't have a lot of bite when you come to demand. And that's almost like, that's similar for less than high school as well. And that's going to motivate how we approach those definitions once we get into the model. But for college and for high school graduate, you see these really different patterns, and one is going upward and one is going downward. Yes?
So some college is also a mix of educational outcomes, right? For some people, I have an associate or vocational or some kind of degree that's typically required for a certain job that's less than a college degree, and other people they went to a 4-year college and didn't finish. So in that sense, it's kind of a mix of different educational outcomes.
It is a mix of different educational outcomes. Just if you take those two groups, one group looks a lot like high school graduate in terms of wages. So when you try to separate between those two groups in a model, it's really hard to separate them from high school graduate. That's really why we end up in a situation like that, where we have one composite group. But in terms of heterogeneity, they are not that different in terms of wages. So that's the best we can do, at least on that front.
Maybe this isn't in the model, but do you have a sense of how much of the patterns for college graduates differ between college graduates and postgraduates?
I had that at some point, but there is more heterogeneity once you account for advanced, what we used to call advanced, but it's really tiny as a group. It's only 5% of the sample, and it's not present everywhere across the analysis. So we just merge it with college. So the other thing that we do see in the data, and that's based on NLSY, so what we call mismatch. So you can be overeducated, so you have more education than what your job requires. You can be undereducated, you have less education than what your job required, and you can be even educated. And what you do see is that if you think about overeducation for different types of groups, if you have some college, you end up overeducated for a really long period of your career, even though that overeducation seems to decrease over time. You do see that there is a lot of mismatch. For college educated and for some college educated, there are a lot of people who are in jobs where they are overeducated for those jobs. You have undereducation for people who are less than high school, and that again seems to be increasing over time. And just in terms of patterns, it just seems like there is a lot of mismatch. So education doesn't guarantee, acquiring that education doesn't guarantee that you end up in a job that fits your skills.
So when these things are changing over time, is it entirely through job hopping, or is the educational requirement of the job changing over time?
No, because we have our coursework, and we use the coursework over all the period. This is all because you are changing jobs over time. Like there is no definition change, because no, that's not what is driving this. It's just career dynamics that are leading to those dynamics.
When you think about overeducation here,
Uh-huh.
so somebody acquires, like the way you conceptualize this, I don't know, somebody acquires a college degree, now he has the skills of a college degree, and he is in a job that doesn't require his skills? Or do we think of it as somebody gets a college degree, but he really didn't learn anything while he was in college, at least a fraction of them, and so they're actually well matched, right, in a way? Like, I don't know which way you think about it.
Oh, okay. I think that you go to college and you learn something.
Like
everybody learns something. Otherwise, I don't think we should be doing this job. But like, yeah, I feel like at least that's the way I'm thinking about it. But I conceptualize this as you go to college, you learn something. But then when you arrive on the labor market, there are frictions. You cannot identify that job. So you are going to end up in a position waiting for a better job, and that might happen, and it might not happen. But I take your point that.
No, it's not a point. I just want to know which way I need to think. What
Okay.
avenue I need to think down.
My suspicion is that those overeducated might be disproportionately humanities majors.
I don't have majors, but I can take your word for it.
How do you think about the timing of the search? Like if you don't do college, then you kind of have your young years, you have longer to find a job. You do college and
No, this is a very simple model. We don't think about things like that. We everyone has a life cycle. Education is acquired in one period, so we don't think that college take 4 years. You take it overnight, and we all enter the labor market at the same time. So search is really going to we enter the labor market and you can search. So the only thing that's going to be different is that if you take two person at the same age, one person is going to start searching earlier than the other one, but it's not. We don't think that because you haven't spent 4 years in college, it's going to be easier for you to search. That's not the assumption, but we could think about something like that. Okay, so now if we think about the wage consequences of those things, the wage consequences of overeducation and undereducation, you see that, and if you are undereducated as a high school dropout or a high school graduate, all of those things are going to pay more than if you are evenly educated. That's the line in red here. So it seems like some people just are able to substitute education for something else. And that substitution is going to be important if you want to try to understand the wage dynamics that are in the data. Okay? And finally, just to get a sense about the effect of demand, supply, and wage inequality, what we are doing here is that we are using state-level variation. So you have 50 states in the US, and with those 50 states, there are differences in how, in the supply of education over time and in the demand of education over time. So what I'm doing here is, and I'm just running a simple regression trying to understand wage inequality. And then what I'm doing is trying to see if there is a supply shock in this state because there have been some policy or something like that. How does wage inequality react to that? Okay? And obviously, if you look at specification 1 and 4, I don't have any control. You have this huge effect. But then I try to have state fixed effect and year fixed effect. And then the interpretation is really like if there is a change in supply between period T and period T plus 1, how wage inequality react to that, accounting for everything that's state fixed, that's fixed over time, or anything that's fixed that's for that state. Okay, so you do see a positive correlation here, both for supply and demand, and all of those things are going to motivate the way we approach the paper.
So the right left-hand side variable, right-hand side variable is fraction with a college degree, is that?
The left-hand side is the wage inequality measure, which is the interdecile ratio, like the ratio between the 10% who are being paid the most and the 10% who are being paid the less. And the right-hand side is either the share of college graduate or the share of jobs that require a college degree. Okay? And when we say demand, it's the share of jobs that require a college degree. When we say supply, it's the share of people with a college graduate. Okay? And that's what we have here. Okay, just in terms of modeling, here is what we are going to do. This is going to be something like a two-stage model. In the first stage, you are going to have workers and firms, and we are going to invest workers in education and firms in a technology, which is going to be production technology, which is also just going to be like a skill requirement. And in the second stage, once those investments are sunk, completely done, people are going to enter the labor market. Search and matching is going to happen at that time. If you match with someone, you are going to produce, earn a wage, and you keep going that until you die, pretty much. Okay? So it seems like risk aversion is important in that world because education is going to be a very risky investment just because you can decide to get that education and not graduate, and your earnings are going to depend a lot on who you match with. Okay? So the way we want to approach that, at least the way we can do that without making the model too complicated is adopt what is called in decision theory as Crabbe-Portis risk preference. And the way that's going to work is that you are going to have a temporal resolution of uncertainty. In the first period where you are making investment decision, you are risk averse, okay? And you are risk averse or you are averse to inequality. You just see that there is a distribution of potential earnings once you graduate. And because you are averse to that, that's going to create some curvature in your choice and generate risk aversion. But once you enter in the labor market, then you have linear preferences. There is no risk aversion anymore. And we can solve the search and matching model much more easily by adopting that structure. You still have wage inequality, and the structure of the model is not changed in any regard, but we have to adopt this kind of ad hoc way of risk aversion, because risk aversion in search and matching is really something that's very difficult to do. If no one is shocked, I'm going to continue. So we are going to have some heterogeneity. Workers are going to be heterogeneous in ability, which is exogenous in the model. They are going to be heterogeneous in parental background, and they have some learning shock. Firms are going to be heterogeneous in some productivity and the skill preference shock. Based on those two things, we are going to decide which education to get and which skill requirement to get. So standard theoretical framework for a search and matching model. Time is going to be continuous here. Interest rates are, some people are going to die at a rate D, and you have an effective discount rate of 4 here. Usually we think about once you have entered the labor market, you are going to be risk neutral, and you are just trying to maximize your lifetime flow utility by making search decisions. So there is a lot of notation here, but simply I want you to understand two things. Workers are going to be heterogeneous in ability and in education once they have exercised their education choice, and you are going to have a joint distribution for those things. And there is going to be unemployment, and that's what I'm going to denote by U. So L is the measure of people in a specific ability group and education group, and you get the same measure for employed and unemployed workers. Go ahead, Peter.
What is the ability, is the ability correlated with the parental background or not?
It could be. We don't make any stand on that. This is, ability is data. Okay, ability is really data. We just take AFQT score in the NLSY, and that's your ability. And we have your parental education also in the data. And we allow for any type, we don't rule out for any type of correlation when we do estimation. So jobs are going to be, there's going to be a distribution of firm productivity P. And based on, given that productivity, firms are going to decide also to get a scale requirement. But usually, the way we are going to see that once that scale requirement decision is made, when you are searching, you are not sampling only firms with productivity, you are sampling bundles, firms with a productivity and a scale requirement, and you cannot adjust any of those dimensions when you are searching. Okay, so you have an N, which is the total number of jobs, and you have a V, which is going to be the number of vacant firms in the economy. So just like in any search model, at least in any equilibrium search model, you are going to have a market tightness, and that's going to relate the number of individuals, L here, to the number of jobs, the number of vacancies to the number of people who are searching. And because we have on-the-job search, you have unemployed people who are searching, and you have employed people who are searching for better jobs. Okay, and that's why the denominator is like that. And based on that, standard definition just allows you to figure out what the job arrival rate and things like that are going to be. And lambda U is going to be the job arrival rate for unemployed workers, and lambda E is going to be the rate at which, if you are working, you can find another job. So mismatch, we are just going to allow for any sort of mismatch. We are going to assume that as long as this surplus function, which is going to guide whether or not matching are being created, if this surplus is positive, then firms are going to have interest to create that job. So that can happen in a setting where you are undereducated. You can be, if you are a high ability worker, and I will show you that when I show you estimate of a surplus function, if you are a high ability and for some reason you drop out from high school, you can end up in a job that require a college degree if the surplus is positive. You can be undereducated in the data. So we allow the model to match that. So we are just going to let the surplus function guide those match being created or not. And finally, there is the surplus function that gives you a dynamic incentive and take into account all the dynamics. And there is the production function that's completely static. So if we match, the production function is going to tell you how much you are creating in that match. Okay, and that's going to be the function f. We are going to left it completely unrestricted, and usually the standard way of doing that is to assume that the production is going to be maximized if you are matched within the same education group. But based on what I showed you, it's not clear that that's the case. So because of that, we are just going to estimate that completely non-parametrically and estimate a match parameter for each bundle, education and skill requirement, and let all those parameters adjust completely. So just in terms of wages, and tell you how this is going to work. So the surplus function is going to be if we decide to form a match, the surplus function is going to tell me what I'm getting out of that match, okay? And that's the difference between the value of employment and the value of unemployment for the worker, and the value of having a filled vacancy and the value of a vacancy for the firm. Okay, so if you sum those two, you get what we are going to call the surplus function. Because we are thinking about educational policies, we are going to apply taxes on that surplus function. So government can collect tax on that surplus function to finance any educational policies. Okay, so every match is going to pay some tax rate on this. So we can specify this tax rate to be as progressive as we want. It seems like that's an important feature of these education choices.
You can also say that when you think about your results showing wage inequality is going to go up, you can think about how more progressive you would need the tax system in order to deal with that.
We will do that. We are working on that. We haven't done it yet. It's based on what we have done so far. It's not clear that progressive taxation is going to help, just because if you have a tax rate that's much more progressive that's much higher. So the marginal tax rate being really higher at the end of for high ability, high education, high productivity firms, that's not going to discourage investment. What it's going to do is imply that you are going to pay those people more in the long run. So it's not completely clear how it's going to go, but we will definitely look at that. So if you match with someone, for simplicity, we are just going to assume that worker is going to get beta H share of the surplus. So that bargaining parameter is going to depend on your education, okay? And that's the share of the wage you are going to get out of that matching relationship. And then when there is on-the-job search, so you are working for a firm, you are contacted by another firm, how wages are going to change. Just for identification, the simplest way to do that is to think about it as a take it or leave it offers. So for example, if you work at, at University of Quebec in Montreal, and you are contacted by Queen's University, essentially you go to the firm that have a higher surplus at the wage which is going to be the surplus of the lowest productive firm. So if you are working at a university and another firm contacts you, you are just going to take the wage of the minimum of the surplus between those two firms, and that's going to be on your wage. And mobility, the direction of mobility is going to be simple, because you are going to go to the most productive firm and then end up with the mean of those two surplus functions.
Essentially, you don't have the banana bond counter offer bargaining. It's either you already have the most surplus you're going to get from your current firm, they give you the most surplus they're going to give you with the new firm, and you just choose. Is that right?
Yeah, we don't have that. We used to. it cannot be identified. Because we are trying to estimate the beta parameter, there is just not enough data to identify a beta parameter in that setting. Okay.
So my question was actually, the fact that the wages are bargained with private firms, are we worried at all that some of them, that workers might be more, because you have bargaining in the model, workers might be more indifferent towards mismatch than they actually are in the data, in the sense that if they're put in a bad match, or if they're mismatched in some way, the firm can bargain the wage to still maximize the profit of a bad match in some way, so that.
What do you mean?
So I guess I'm thinking about a world. So there's a whole class of search models where they think of kind of positive, negative assorted matching and so on. So for a world where there's positive assorted matching, to the extent that a type Q job is not with the correct H, there's the firm is off its the firm is not optimizing production because they could always get a better match to get that. If you have bargain wages, they can just offer a lower wage to offset the lost profits of a bad match, so they're essentially indifferent. And I'm wondering if that bargaining process is essentially generating essentially more mismatch than you would otherwise get if, for example, wages were posted or wages were taken to leave it offered from the start.
I don't think so. Usually, like firms cannot, let me say the following. Firms cannot manipulate the offers we are making. There is a surplus, okay? There is a surplus and you get a share of that surplus if you're unemployed. And if you are contacted by another firm, you just get the surplus of that other firms. Like maybe I'm not understanding your question correctly, but it seems like what you are saying is that firms could change the skill requirement to match your skill if I match with you later.
No, I think a little more simple than that. I'm thinking that if you had, for example, wage posting instead of wage bargaining, that the quantitative amount of surplus you would get from a particular HQ match would be smaller in the wage posting world than it would be in the wage bargaining world.
Oh, that's a very strong statement. I don't think we can say that. Like, if you have a wage posting model, usually the way wage posting is going to work is that you have an objective function, which is I'm going to maximize my production. So you select a wage contract that's going to maximize your profit. Usually, we end up in situation where wage posting can be very similar to wage bargaining, depending on the bargaining parameter. So it just depends on the rent parameter. So if you go in another end of the spectrum where you think about this bargaining parameter or reflecting something like the Hosier's condition, where bargaining rate is going to be the elasticity of a matching function to one worker, wage posting and wage bargaining is essentially going to be the same. So it's not clear even theoretically that bargaining has any effect on those. Like by forcing people to bargain, firms and worker, you could, in a sense, essentially reduce the inefficiency problem because you tie your hand to a specific bargaining schedule, which is not the case if you have wage posting. Okay. So I'm just going to define the value functions because I need them to show education choices. So the value function of someone who is unemployed is the production of unemployment, which is unemployment benefit here. And here, this fancy sum is just because we are taking a sum on some discrete variables and some continuous variables. That's the way we are going to use that to get that sum, okay? It's just that you are taking a sum over skill requirement, which is a discrete variable, and firm productivity, which is a continuous variable. So you are just going to select all jobs here that gives you positive surplus. And that's your value function. If you are thinking about the value of employment, it's even worse. But basically, it's the simplest idea. So you have wages, you can get fired from your job, you can find a better job. And if you find a better job, your new wage is going to be that. Okay, that's the basic idea. And once I have that, I can think about education choices and how education choices are going to work. So I do that in two stages. So what I've been presenting so far is just once we have entered the labor market. Now I'm going backward to think about education choices. And education choices are going to be given by this equation. So you have the cost of education, that's something that you need to pay. And your cost of education is going to depend on your ability, your learning track, the education level you are getting, and parental education. And you make a trade-off between all, you take this education level that's going to maximize your utility. That's the cost. The benefit is going to be either you decide to take that education level H prime and you don't fail. Okay, there is a risk of dropping out once you get the education, and that's this psi here. Okay, so you can graduate, and if you graduate, you get the lifetime value of people who do graduate with that education level, and you can drop out, and if you drop out, you drop out to one of those mismatch states. So the way I'm framing this is just that there are two education levels, at least there are two choices, but because people can drop out, you end up with four education levels. You choose between college and high school, but choosing college does not guarantee getting a college degree. You can end up in some college. You can choose high school, but even there, it doesn't guarantee that you graduate from high school. Okay, and that's the formulation here. So that's the odd part, and the part that really works well to identify to match some of the feature of the data, which is risk aversion, and that's where we are going to introduce risk aversion. So because we have a search and matching model, we can compute lifetime values for different individuals, and we do see a distribution. So essentially what we are going to do is compute those lifetime values and then plug the lifetime values here, but then on this side, we are going to add some aversion to inequality, which is going to be captured by this parameter, and that's going to essentially introduce risk aversion in the choice problem. Okay? And that's the way we get that done here. So if we think about the cost of education, we parameterize it in a way where there are some things that depend on ability that could be psychic cost, and we have pecuniary cost as well. So when we do the experiment, at least when we do the financing experiment, what we do is that we subsidize only the pecuniary cost, not the psychic cost, so that we don't have too much responses in terms of what is going to happen.
How does that relate to VU? I guess that's my point. I don't understand. So I would have put VU there.
Yeah. It relates to VU in the sense that VU, when you enter the labor market, is something like your lifetime value, okay, weighted by the unemployment risk, okay? So that's, it's really close to that, but instead of, because VU is a number, but we want just to get this idea that there is not one number, there is a distribution in the population, okay? So by having a curvature parameter over that, we capture not only the mean value, which would be VU, but also the fact that there may be some standard deviation on this, and sometimes people do not like this uncertainty over that potential lifetime value. Okay? Just in terms of skill requirement, so same thing, we define the value of a vacancy, and essentially what we are going to assume, there is nothing hard here, just that you as a firm, you are going to find the skill requirement that maximize your vacancy value, and that's what we are going to do here. Okay? Very simple. So I'm just going to skip that, and just giving you some equilibrium conditions. Essentially, okay. Yeah, free entry conditions is going to work. You have a steady state for unemployment rate. The inflow into unemployment is going to be equal to the outflows. The distribution of matches is going to be constant. I'm going fast, and then we define the equilibrium, the stationary equilibrium, which is not going to be efficient just because people may under invest in education or over invest, we don't know, but it's not going to be efficient. Okay?
In terms of the
this search, the matching thing, how many or what type of submarkets are there?
Oh, there is no submarket. There is one market.
One matching function.
There is one matching function. Submarkets, we could, in principle, do submarkets, but usually, when you look at the data, there is not much in terms of those margins. Like when you get a college degree, of course, you spend less of your life in unemployment, but it's not huge compared to people who don't get a college degree. So if you create these submarkets, you just force people to get into those submarkets, and it really doesn't help much fitting the data.
You just went over that. The queue, there's a choice for the queue. You didn't talk about. Is there a cost to deciding the queue?
Yeah.
So is that decision necessarily optimal as well? You talk about the suboptimalities of cost of education, but is the skill requirement? It seems like that might be suboptimal as well.
There might be suboptimality everywhere, but there is a cost of choosing a specific education skill requirement. Okay, and yeah, and that's going to be reflected in the production.
So both of those are probably good.
Yeah.
It seems like you're gonna have two types of you're gonna have composition externalities. When you think about it.
Yeah, in equilibrium, yes.
But they're gonna come from both sides potentially. So you might have underwritten education, you might have also skill requirements.
Yes. Yeah, that's fair to explain. So we are going to estimate the model by moments. It's fairly easy if you think about it. This is a two-stage problem. You can solve the search problem really easily, and then you get education choices to go through in the second stage. The problem is identification, but okay, I'm just trying to explain why we do that. So everything is going to be parametric, of course. If you change the parametric functions, you get different parameters. Okay, I'm gonna say that. And then we are going to parameterize all of those things to make sure that we get as close to the data as possible. The most important thing is the production function. In this M function, we really estimate a bundle, education skill requirement, and we estimate one parameter for each bundle. And we get that interacted with productivity to capture potential complementarity between firms and workers. Okay? So everything is pretty standard otherwise. So there are things that we do not estimate. The discount rate is not estimated, the death rate is not estimated, and the risk aversion parameter is not estimated as well. We just do this estimate with different values. So I have arguments for all of the functions that I'm showing, but I'm just gonna talk about sorting and how we think about sorting in that setting. Usually, in those type of model, when you think about sorting, you think about an argument where initially people are mismatched, but over time, because mobility is efficient, they move to more productive firms. So if you look at how cross-sectional variance in wages is changing over time, you should see that increasing if there is positive associative matching. We are going to use the same idea, but with another thing that works even better in our case. If you have positive associative matching, what should happen is that if you have an increase in the supply of education, demand should react positively as well. Because if there is positive associative matching between college jobs and college workers, then if you increase the supply of something, the demand of that thing should follow. So as a moment, we are going to use a regression between those two things and capture the correlation between supply and demand of skills. And that's going to be one of the moments we use to identify sorting. And thinking about education choices here, like if you follow all the arguments, we can identify the lifetime value of people. Once you have those lifetime value, education choices is just going to be identification at least is going to come from a discrete choice model. Okay, you are choosing between different education level given differences in lifetime values. The only thing that we cannot identify is that we put a scale parameter in front of that education, and usually in discrete choice model, this scale parameter is not identified. So what we are going to do is calibrate this scale parameter, at least match it to make sure that we match the partial equilibrium effect of these policies. So usually you have in partial equilibrium, if you give it $1,000 subsidy in tuition, enrollment increased by something like 2%. So we are going to target this 2% to estimate this sigma c. And these are the set of moments. So it's a mix of moments and indirect inference because we also use regression outcomes in the estimation. So the model fits, but I'm not going to show you that. So I'm just going to skip that parameter as well, just to show you the surplus function. And what I'm plotting here is the surplus function for different education and different skill requirements, because in the model, we are just going to have 2 skill requirements. There is no mismatch in the sense that you don't decide, I'm just going to create that job, and at the end, you end up with a different demand level. So there is only 2 skill requirements, but there is 4 education level because of mismatch. And what the surplus function is showing you is this trade-off between you have a value of employment, you have a value of unemployment, you have a value of a vacancy, and you have a value of a job bid field. Okay? And based on that, you decide whether or not you are going to create a job. If a surplus is negative, if a surplus is negative, we are not going to create that job. And if it's positive, firms are always going to find it profitable to create that job because you don't know when you might meet someone who fits your job, your skill requirement. Okay? So what you do see here is that there is firm productivity here in surplus. Most of the time for mid ability and high ability workers, this relationship is positive. But for low ability workers, this surplus is going down in more productive firms. You have clear differences in terms of scale here when you think about this surplus function and this surplus function, just to tell you that if you think about these people working, college educated workers working in college required jobs, their surplus is going to be much higher than these people who have lower education, just to show you the scale in terms of differences, in terms of wages that are going to be implied. Okay. We have a cost estimates here. I'm just going to run this idea by you. I have two minutes. So basically what we want to do, we haven't quite managed to do it yet, but what we want to do with the framework is to think about optimal subsidies. We know that the equilibrium is not efficient, but we can compute the efficient allocation, meaning that once we have all the objects that we need here, we can maximize the welfare function, and that welfare function is going to return a distribution of skill requirement, a distribution of education that's going to be optimal in the sense of a planner. And because we have taxes, we have ways to achieve that, and we can compare that distribution to what we see in the data. And we can also see how much subsidy is going to take to get to that, to that level of skill requirement and education. We can do it in many different ways because we are taxing really surplus. So that's the side of revenues. But we could give subsidies not only to workers, but we could also give it to firms so that they adjust their skill requirement decisions. And that would make an experiment that's going to be, we can target workers or firms and see which policy is going to be more efficient. But that's not what we did so far. So what we did is giving subsidies, and this is based on an older version of the model, so some of the things are different. So we had compulsory education, and we had that in general equilibrium and in partial equilibrium, and we are just contrasting those numbers. The most important numbers that I wanted to show you here is how the welfare gains that you do see once you implement those subsidies. This is the 0.88% I was telling you about. If you give a 5,000 subsidy, you increase welfare by 2.4%. And if you give a 10,000 subsidy, you increase welfare by 4%. But interestingly, compared to all of those cases, most of the time you do increase wage inequality in all of those settings. Even though average wages increase, wage inequality also increase because people, higher ability workers, just get better jobs, and those better jobs end up increasing wage inequality. And just to wrap up, so we have presented a model with schooling investment and potential mismatch on both wages and education. We show that choosing subsidies has a small but positive effect on average earnings, but they do increase wage inequality. And that's it. Thank you.